Jesus cannot get a moment's rest. And neither, at least in today's gospel, can the disciples. And neither in the world we live in can we. The disciples, now called apostles, meaning those who have been sent, gather around Jesus and tell him all that they have done and taught. Jesus says, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." That sounds awesome. It's busy where they are, people coming and going, no time even to eat. So they get into a boat for a little retreat, but the crowd follows them. And even though a bunch of verses are left out of what we heard this morning, we know what happens in these in-between verses that we didn't hear. Jesus has compassion on the crowd. He feeds them a miraculous meal, thousands of them. Then the disciples leave again in a boat, and the wind picks up in a terrifying way. That thunderclap we just heard. Imagine being on the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus walks on water, calms the storm, calms the disciples. All of this is off stage, but we've heard the stories and we can imagine them. Lots of trauma for everyone. And again, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, more crowds. The people rushed about the whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard Jesus was. And wherever he went, people begged that they might even touch the fringe of his garment. And all who touched him were healed. In Jesus' time, the establishment viewed illness as a punishment for sins. People with everyday diseases were considered ritually unclean and therefore excluded from temple life. The very rich would hire professional healers. The poor and everyone else relied on healers like Jesus and the apostles, who had the courage and the presence to lay hands on anyone who asked. For Jesus to heal the poor and the outcast was to make the radical claim that they were full members of the community. To free them from illness and restore them to community was to disrupt expectations and upend the social order. To free them was to give rest to people who knew no rest. The disciples participate in this disruption simply by bringing the sick to Jesus. Be that as it may, I am exhausted just thinking about this gospel. In real life, these few paragraphs, the ones we heard this morning and the ones sandwiched in between, probably happened over several days, maybe longer, but still. So I have this image of all these crowds circling around Jesus, but Jesus remains calm. He doesn't have to do anything. He just has to have compassion and show up. The crowd keeps showing up because they recognize Jesus' offer not only of healing, but also liberation and restoration to community, simply through being present. Hope and Bread is a new street church that meets every Sunday evening in Montevilla Park, providing presence, hospitality, and bread breaking to people who would be considered in every way unclean and unwelcome in Jesus' time. We learn over and over again on Sunday evenings that being present and inviting others to join us is all that we are called to do. There is healing and liberation that comes from inclusion and being together with our outcast neighbors. Mark's gospel is always characterized by immediacy and urgency. In this morning's gospel, we hear about ministry and rest. So I'd like to suggest that we consider those two things, ministry and rest, with equal urgency. So where do we find rest amid the chaos and disruption of our own collective and individual lives? There is collective trauma in our city and in our nation. This community has lost in the last year a beloved rector and is moving into the future with hope and strength, but also with uncertainty and loss. I am not going to go on and on about trauma, but is there no time to take a breath? No time to reflect and renew? One of my favorite poets is Terence Hayes, who is not to be confused with the person running for office in East Portland of the same name. The poet Terence Hayes said, "Trouble is how we learn what the soul is." I would agree, and I would say the same thing about rest. Rest is how we learn what the soul is. It's both. What if rest is not what we think it is? What if, when Jesus said to the disciples, "Come away to a deserted place and rest a while," he was inviting them out into the wilderness where anything can happen? What if the rest that God offers is where healing and rest happens right in the middle of chaos and disruption? What if rest in God is portable? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote that the meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. Building committees of the world, take note. The biblical idea of Sabbath as one of the commandments came relatively late in the history of the people of Israel. In the era after the first temple was destroyed and God's people were living in exile by the rivers of Babylon. They were asking the question, how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Those words were captured in Psalm 137 and made popular by Jimmy Cliff and covered by dozens of others, my favorite being Steve Earle. The answer to that question, how do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, was a different kind of Sabbath. A temple not in space, but in time. Again, Rabbi Heschel writes, Sabbath is when we are called to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation. From the world of creation to the creation of the world. I'll say it again. Sabbath is when we are called to turn from the results of creation, space, to the mystery of creation, time. We cannot always take an entire day for a traditional Sabbath. But what if we, like Jesus, move through that endless rhythm of serving and resting, even minute by minute or hour by hour? It is in God's presence where rest is. in the wilderness places where God calls us. That can be anywhere. I would invite you, or challenge you, take your pick, to take some moments or hours in the coming week, each day, to consider the mystery of creation. Consider also that the bread of life, which we will hear about for the next 5 Sundays, is food for our journey and food for our rest. Consider that the bread which we are about to receive at this table through the mystery of creation is food for our journey and food for our rest. Come away and rest a while.